Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. We're here at the Small Cells World Summit 2015 in London's Docklands, and I'm talking with Michael Hogan, who is the Senior Director, Broadband Carrier Access, Small Cell and Fixed Wireless at Broadcom Corporation of Silicon Valley in California. Michael, welcome. When we were talking before we came on shot, you were saying that Broadcom is a world leader in small cell chipset solutions. Now, maybe not everybody knows that, because Broadcom's got quite a wide remit and a lot going on. So tell us a bit more about that and where this experience and success comes from.
Well, Broadcom's been in small cells since 2010, and I think we're leaders in several ways. First of all, we're the only ones that ship a small cell solution that was actually designed bottoms up to be a small cell. Most of our competitors are trying to take macro cell chipsets and tear them apart, scale them down to hit the power and size requirements that the definition of small cell alludes to. In addition, we're the largest supplier of small cells to the industry. We ship in every region of the world. Each of the existing technologies, 3G, 4G, multiple carriers, and are well ahead in areas like LTE and carrier aggregation.
I'm very glad to be able to ask you a few questions then. And as you said, small cells have been around for some time now. They've gone through several phases, iterations, etc. Where do you expect to see small cell technology in 5 years' time? And the reason I'm asking you this is because traditionally in telecommunications, we've not been able to look further forward than usually in a year or 18 months or so, because the industry is so dynamic, it changes so quickly. There are mergers and acquisitions, consolidations, new technologies, new companies, all the rest of it. But this time we seem to be looking further away on the telescope, mainly because of the notion of, you've probably heard of it as often as I have, the 2020 network or Network 2020, virtualization, transformation, the new network, SDN, NFV, etc., etc. So, where do you think small cell is going to be in all that in 2020?
Well, I think it's two different tracks. I think small cells on their own, as you mentioned, have taken longer than folks had predicted, but I don't think that's unique to small cells. I think that's actually a cycle that repeats itself oftentimes in this industry. So everybody would have been happier if it had gone quicker, but it's really not completely out of phase with what we've seen in other wireless technologies. So I think you have that dynamic. I think the dynamic you're referring to on 2020 actually means that not only independently will small cells be reaching sort of the levels that had been predicted, but the idea of a virtualized network will benefit greatly from having more small cells deployed, because the more baseband processing and layer 2 and layer 3 processing you do out at the edge, the lower the latency is back to this cloud that's supposed to connect everything and do all the things that are promised by this 2020 vision. Okay.
Now, you mentioned the fact that, again, when we were talking off camera, we were saying that perhaps in some respects small cells hadn't reached the potential they might have had. Let's explore that a little bit more for the moment. If you remember the hype that there was a couple of years ago about all this, it was promised that small cells would be absolutely everywhere. Sure, they're in the home and in residential areas. Sure, and for sure, they are in the enterprise. They're certainly increasingly used in rural and in remote areas, but that promise of the ubiquitous deployment of small cells in the outdoor urban environment simply hasn't happened. Now, you say that's because of sort of not quite in phase and all the rest of it. So we need to put down the fact that it hasn't developed to the extent that the marketeers promised it would. It was just purely hype?
No, I don't think it's hype. I think the areas that you've seen it take often make sense. A residential deployment is really an agreement between a single resident and his operator. Sure. So that can, not only is there a tremendous volume, but you can get to that agreement relatively quickly. The agreement to put something in an enterprise is between the person who owns the infrastructure in the enterprise and maybe their IT department or their carrier. But so it takes a little longer, a little more thought out, but still, a simple group of folks have to agree. I think frankly, when you get to outdoor, one of the challenges is you're outdoors in a public space, in a public venue where you've got costs and right-of-ways and a whole range of decision makers that get pulled in who, aren't necessarily economically motivated. There's a number of different, political considerations where, where can you put these, where can't you put these, who do you have to contract with, who can the vendors be, and in all honesty, I don't know that it should be a big surprise that takes longer. So I think in Wi-Fi, how did it roll out? Customers got access points in their home. They started showing up in airports. They started showing up, in their business. Whereas the last places that you really got Wi-Fi, public access. Yeah. And so I don't think that this is very unique.
Not really a surprise.
Not a surprise.
Okay, thank you. One of the controversies, it is a controversy, I suppose, that's taking place at the moment, is about what's generically being referred to as LTEU, or LAA in standards parlance. So LTE across the public spectrum. How do you think LTEU should be viewed? And the reason I'm asking this is because there are two sides to the story, of course, two sides to the argument. One side, shall we say, the cynics and and those against the idea say this is a typical big telco attempt to get a hammerlock on the competition on unlicensed spectrum, and they're going to hold on to it for as long as they can. Mm-hmm. The other side says, well, it's only to be expected that the big telcos and try and leverage what they've got and the strength they have, but in the long term, LTEU is going to be a user-friendly method of aggregating data to provide a better service for end users all around. You're a vendor caught in between two stools here. What do you make of that argument, and where do you sit with it? Are you one camp, that camp, or are you on the fence?
I think the idea of licensed assisted access is one that the industry will have to get their heads around, as it has many other opportunities. The idea of LTE replacing 3G was a step forward. The idea of aggregating carriers for LTE was a step forward. The idea of having one of those carriers be in the unlicensed band, is a natural extension of what is essentially quest for more bandwidth. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong-headed about trying to figure out how to use an unlicensed band, and it's not a technical problem. The fact that Broadcom has a solution today that ships with LTE and carrier aggregation says that, whether I aggregate another licensed band or an unlicensed band really isn't relevant. What's relevant is when a service that is, used to owning the entire channel that it occupies because it's licensed enters into a band where all of the existing devices in that band have worked out a protocol of sharing. You have an inherent conflict between a standard that's based on how do I share and a standard that's based on the idea that I own the spectrum. It's a licensed spectrum. So what needs to be worked out is the merging of those two philosophies, and I think LAA will evolve to make sure that the aggressor coming into that channel anew does certain things to be a good neighbor, that it knows when Wi-Fi is trying to communicate, that it doesn't in aggregate reduce the actual throughput of the channel. Yep. And there's a perfectly well thought out standards process to get through that, and Broadcom will support it, and we have all those capabilities today. The idea that it's going to happen overnight, go back to your first question. Does anything ever happen overnight in this industry? No. Is it an operator scheme writ large to access spectrum as a land grab? No, I think it's just the nature of the demand for data says I've got to go find more spectrum. I either have to find more spectrum or I have to do more with the spectrum I've got. This is sort of a meeting of both of those thoughts. What I think it is certain parties wanting to accelerate the standards body. So LTEU Forum, I believe, will, as history looks back, be some pre-standard proprietary form of what ultimately gets deployed. But it's probably more, it's probably not an operator trying to do something mischievous. It's probably more of vendors at all different levels looking to create an advantage for themselves you know, at a given time and place when, you know, they maybe aren't doing as well with the existing technologies that are trying to get rolled out. LTE, carrier aggregation, you know, if you don't have those, it makes sense to say, oh wait, what you really need is this next thing.
Right.
You know, and I think that's probably the fallacy in the argument.
That was a great answer, very cogent answer. It's the best one I've ever heard. So thanks for that. That was really good. You covered it all. That was really good. Final question to you then, Michael, if I might. We're coming to the end. How important do you think small cells are going to be in 5G? Let's say 5G is with us in 2020. Where will small cells be in that sort of heterogeneous network?
Well, I'm probably somewhat biased, so I'll admit that up front. But yeah. I think small cells will provide the intelligence at the edge of the network for wireless networks that has never kind of historically been there. Because you know, you have to think back the way wireless networks were deployed. You know, if you think of the use case, it was covering a great amount of area with a very thin layer to support a voice call. I think if you look at other networks that were built around providing data and differentiating which data wanted to go where, what type of data it was, there's a very strong precedent for putting more intelligence at the edge of the network. And I think as 5G rolls out, when you kind of net out the incumbent vendors' biases to keep things more like they are, because that's best for them, I think network ideology, wired, wireless, various flavors of standards will rule out, and you'll have very high volume, very smart edge devices that run at very low costs and run at very low power levels, so they can be ubiquitous, so they can be plugged into Ethernet, so they can be deployed with very low costs, not acquisition costs of a box, but you know, the folks who have to put those boxes into service, you know, don't have to be, you know, as trained, as expert, you know, as somebody you'd send out to put in a macro cell.
So it's more of a modular solution.
It's much more modular, and I think what you'll have is a cellular network that looks more like, you know, cellular access points everywhere, the way you currently today enjoy Wi-Fi access points everywhere, and you know, there's no reason you can't have access points that are both, and I think that's probably the trend.
That's again brilliant answer. Thanks very much indeed, Michael Hogan of Broadcom.
Thanks.